What does absolute power truly look like? Forget the images of stern-faced dictators and iron-fisted generals. Forget the political theories and the philosophical warnings. History itself has provided a name that has become a synonym for total corruption, a word that drips with whispers of madness, incest, and a cruelty so profound it borders on the divine. That name is Caligula. For 2,000 years, this single name has been a universal shorthand for depravity. The mad emperor who declared himself a god, who held conversations with the moon, who waged war on the ocean, and who loved his horse so much he planned to make it a consul of Rome. The stories are so lurid, so grotesquely theatrical, they feel more like fever dreams than historical accounts. They paint a picture of a man who was not merely a tyrant, but a monster in human form. But here is what they don't tell you. The story of Caligula is not a biography, it is an indictment. It is a character assassination written in blood and ink by the very men who plunged their daggers into him, his wife, and his infant daughter. It is a narrative meticulously crafted by his enemies and successors to justify an act of brutal regicide. The chief prosecutors in this historical trial are the ancient historians themselves, men like Suetonius and Cassius Dio, whose testimony, written decades after Caligula's death, has painted a portrait of a monster so complete, so utterly irredeemable, that it has defined him for centuries. But what if that portrait is a lie? Or worse, what if it's a carefully constructed caricature, a black legend designed to conceal a more complicated and perhaps even more disturbing truth? What if the madness was a mask and the depravity was a political weapon? This is not going to be a simple retelling of those lurid tales. This is a trial. We are going to step into the courtroom of history itself. We will summon the ancient witnesses and cross-examine their testimony. We will examine the evidence they present. The stories of godhood, the rumors of incest, the legend of a horse destined for political office. We will separate the verifiable facts from the venomous propaganda, and when all the evidence has been presented, you will be the jury. You will be the ones to render the final verdict. Was Gaius Caesar Germanicus, the man nicknamed Caligula, a monster born of a fevered brain? Was he the victim of the most successful character assassination in human history? Or was he something far more terrifying? A calculated political predator who understood the true, ugly nature of power and decided to wear it like a crown of horrors. The trial of Caligula begins now. The first charge laid against Caligula, the foundation upon which his entire legend of insanity is built, is the charge of blasphemy. Not just any blasphemy, but the ultimate act of mortal arrogance, the emperor's decision to declare himself a living god. For the Roman elite, steeped in traditions of republican virtue and the careful separation of man from deity, this was not just a political overreach, it was proof of a mind that had shattered its own connection to reality. But was it truly madness? Or was it a brutal, calculated strategy to seize a power no Roman emperor had ever dared to claim before? When Caligula ascended to the throne in 37 A.D., he was greeted not as a ruler, but as a savior. He was the son of the beloved hero Germanicus, the last flickering ember of a noble bloodline that the public adored. The reign of his predecessor, the paranoid and reclusive Tiberius, had left Rome starved for a charismatic leader. Caligula, young, handsome, and generous in his first months, was a breath of fresh air. He abolished Tiberius's treason trials, granted bonuses to the Praetorian Guard, and hosted lavish games for the people. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed like a golden age had dawned. Then, just 7 months into his reign, something changed. Caligula fell gravely ill, struck down by what the ancient sources call a brain fever. The entire empire held its breath, praying for his recovery. When he finally emerged, he was different. The affable young prince was gone, and in his place stood a man who seemed to believe he had transcended mortality itself. The witnesses for the prosecution, our ancient historians, paint a scene of escalating megalomania. Suetonius tells us Caligula began to openly insist on being treated as a god. He established a temple dedicated to his own divinity, complete with a life-sized golden statue of himself that was dressed each day in the same clothes he was wearing. He appointed priests to his own cult, a college of the wealthiest citizens who were forced to pay exorbitant sums for the honor. Among these priests were his own uncle, Claudius, and eventually his beloved horse, Incitatus. His public appearances became theatrical displays of divine impersonation. One day he would appear dressed as Hercules, complete with a lion's skin and a club. The next he would be Apollo, clutching a lyre and crowned with sun rays. He would engage in bizarre, staged conversations with Jupiter, the king of the gods, sometimes whispering conspiratorially, other times shouting threats at the heavens. He connected his own palace to the temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill, essentially making the chief god of Rome his next-door neighbor. He would stand beside the statues of the gods and demand that onlookers worship him instead, arguing that his living divinity was far more potent than their cold, stone effigies. The arrogance was not confined to Rome. He ordered a colossal statue of himself to be erected in the Temple of Jerusalem, a deliberate act of provocation against the monotheistic Jews that threatened to ignite a massive rebellion across the eastern provinces. Only the frantic and brilliant diplomacy of the Jewish leader, Herod Agrippa, and the convenient timing of Caligula's own assassination prevented a holy war of catastrophic proportions. But the most infamous act of his supposed divine madness was the bridge. In 39 A.D., he ordered the construction of a temporary floating bridge, a pontoon structure made of ships anchored side by side, stretching for nearly 3 miles across the deep waters of the Bay of Baiae. It was a staggering feat of engineering, a monumental waste of resources and manpower, and for what purpose? According to Cassius Dio, it was to defy a prophecy made during the reign of Tiberius, which stated that Caligula had no more chance of becoming emperor than of riding a horse across the Bay of Baiae. Once the bridge was complete, Caligula staged an elaborate 2-day spectacle. On the first day, he rode back and forth across the bridge on his favorite horse, Incitatus, wearing the golden breastplate of Alexander the Great. On the second, he rode in a chariot, followed by his entire army and the spoils of a fabricated war. He had proven the prophecy wrong. He had conquered the sea itself. And then we have the horse. The story of Incitatus has become the ultimate symbol of Caligula's insanity. This was no ordinary steed. Incitatus, which means swift or at full gallop, lived a life of unimaginable luxury. Suetonius claims the horse had a stable made of marble, a manger of ivory, a jeweled collar, and a retinue of slaves dedicated to his every need. Invitations to dinner parties were sent out in the horse's name, and guests were expected to attend and pay their respects. The final, unbelievable act was Caligula's alleged announcement that he intended to make Incitatus a consul, the highest political office in Rome. The image is irresistibly absurd: a horse, draped in the purple-bordered toga of a senator, sitting in the curia, its whinnies and snorts treated as legislative pronouncements. For his enemies, this was the ultimate proof. No sane man would ever contemplate such a thing. This is the evidence presented by the prosecution. A man who dressed as the gods, demanded worship, waged war on nature, and tried to put a horse in charge of the empire. The case for insanity seems overwhelming, but now let's begin the cross-examination. Let's adopt the role of the defense and look for another motive. What if this wasn't madness? but a calculated, brutal form of political theater. Consider the political climate. The Roman emperors who preceded Caligula, Augustus, and Tiberius ruled under a fragile illusion. They pretended to be the first citizen, the princeps, ruling in partnership with the Senate. But it was a lie. The emperor held all the real power, the power of the legions. The Senate, composed of proud, ancient aristocratic families, chafed under this new reality. They clung to their traditions and saw the emperor as an upstart, a necessary evil at best. They were a constant source of plots and conspiracies. Augustus managed them with diplomacy. Tiberius managed them with paranoia and treason trials. Caligula chose a third path, humiliation. From this perspective, every act of divine madness can be reinterpreted as a deliberate act of political warfare against the Senate. By declaring himself a god, Caligula wasn't just satisfying his ego, he was elevating himself to a status the senators could never hope to achieve. He was destroying the illusion of partnership and forcing them to physically prostrate themselves before him. When he forced them to pay fortunes to become priests in his cult, he wasn't just raising funds, he was bankrupting them and making them complicit in their own humiliation. His war on the sea takes on a new light as well. The bridge at Baiae wasn't just about a prophecy, it was a demonstration of absolute power. It showed that he could command the resources of the entire empire for a personal whim. He could literally bend nature to his will. It was a message to the Senate and the people of Rome. My power is limitless. Do not dare to challenge it. The act of marching his army across it, with fake German prisoners in tow, was a mockery of the traditional Roman triumph, a ceremony the Senate held sacred. He was showing them that he alone decided what constituted a victory. And finally, we come to the horse. Was Caligula really going to make Incitatus a consul? It's highly unlikely. The key is that he only announced his intention to do so. The act itself was the message. It was a piece of grotesque political satire aimed directly at the heart of the Senate. The unspoken statement was devastatingly clear. This institution is such a joke, this office has become so meaningless under my absolute rule that even my horse could do the job. In fact, my horse is more worthy of this honor than any of you corrupt, plotting old fools. It was the ultimate insult, a declaration that the Senate's power was a complete fiction. This interpretation doesn't absolve Caligula. It changes the nature of his crime. It replaces the image of a gibbering madman with something far more chilling, the image of a supremely intelligent, arrogant, and ruthless political operator who understood that in the new world of Imperial Rome, the old traditions were dead. He believed that the only way to rule was not through respect, but through a combination of fear and awe. His divinity was a tool, his bridge a statement, and his horse a punchline to a very, very dark joke. So, the jury must now consider, was Exhibit A, this explosion of divine arrogance, the tragic result of a mind destroyed by illness? Or was it the first brutal campaign in a deliberate war to psychologically terrorize the Roman elite into total submission? The answer to that question will determine whether we are dealing with a patient or a predator. We now move from the public stage of divine spectacle to the sealed chambers of the imperial palace. If the first charge against Caligula was a crime against the gods and the state, the second is a crime against human nature itself. This is where the historical accounts descend into a maelstrom of depravity, painting a portrait of an emperor whose appetites were as boundless as his power. The prosecution presents Exhibit B, a life of incest, sexual exploitation, and grotesque decadence that allegedly turned the heart of the Roman Empire into a personal brothel. But as we examine these lurid accusations, we must constantly ask ourselves, Are we peering through a clear window into a monstrous soul? Or are we looking at a distorted reflection in a funhouse mirror, a caricature crafted by his enemies to be as repulsive as possible? The centerpiece of this accusation is Caligula's relationship with his three sisters, Agrippina the Younger, Julia Livilla, and, above all, Julia Drusilla. Roman society, while no stranger to sexual license, held a powerful taboo against incest within the immediate family. Yet, our primary witness, Suetonius, alleges that Caligula engaged in sexual relations with all three of them, and not in secret. He claims that at large banquets, while his wife was present, Caligula would openly have his sisters recline with him, taking each in turn. But his bond with Drusilla was said to be something different, something far deeper and more obsessive. The historians portray a love that transcended brotherly affection and spiraled into a quasi-marital public relationship. He treated her not as a sister, but as a wife, bestowing upon her honors that no Roman woman had ever received. He named her his heir, a radical break from tradition that placed a woman in the direct line of succession. According to the accounts, he lived with her openly, a flagrant violation of every Roman moral code. When Drusilla died suddenly in 38 AD, Caligula's reaction was not one of normal grief. It was a cataclysmic, empire-wide event. He plunged into a period of profound and violent mourning. All public business was suspended. He declared her a goddess, Diva Drusilla, the first Roman woman to be deified, and established a cult in her name. He sentenced a man to death for having been seen laughing on the day of her funeral. This obsessive grief, this elevation of a sister to divine status after an allegedly incestuous relationship, was presented by his detractors as the ultimate proof of a sick and twisted mind. The accusations of sexual depravity did not end with his sisters. The next charge is one of the most shocking: that Caligula transformed the imperial palace into a high-class brothel. Suetonius provides a graphic, almost pornographic account. He claims that Caligula set aside a wing of the palace and furnished it lavishly, then systematically forced the wives and daughters of prominent senators and aristocrats to prostitute themselves there. He would allegedly send his attendants out into the forum and basilicas to invite men of all ages to the palace, where they would be presented with a menu of noblewomen. The proceeds, Suetonius insists, went directly into the imperial treasury. He even describes Caligula acting as a kind of master of ceremonies, boasting about the parentage and virtues of the women on offer and meticulously recording the financial transactions. This story serves a dual purpose for his enemies. It not only paints him as a sexual predator, but also as a pimp emperor, a man who would stoop to the most degrading acts imaginable to satisfy both his lust and his greed. It's an image of perfect corruption. Finally, the prosecution presents evidence of his monumental, almost pathological, extravagance. The vast fortune left by the frugal Emperor Tiberius, estimated to be around 2.7 billion sesterces, an astronomical sum, was allegedly squandered by Caligula in less than a year. The stories of his spending are legendary. He was said to have hosted banquets of unimaginable opulence, serving loaves of bread gilded with gold, and dishes made from the tongues of flamingos and the brains of peacocks. He didn't just drink fine wine. According to Seneca, he would dissolve priceless pearls in vinegar and drink them down in a single gulp, simply for the decadent thrill of consuming a fortune. He was said to have constructed pleasure barges on Lake Nemi, floating palaces complete with marble floors, plumbing, jewel-encrusted sails, and even gardens with fruit-bearing trees. He gambled away fortunes, showered his favorite actors and chariot drivers with gifts, and was said to have once scattered large sums of money from the top of a basilica to the crowds below, delighting in the chaos and injuries as people scrambled to collect the coins. This wasn't just spending. It was a war on fiscal responsibility, an almost religious devotion to waste. When the treasury ran dry, his accusers claim, he turned to extortion, false accusations, and forced inheritances to fund his lifestyle, bleeding the Roman elite dry. This is the prosecution's case for Exhibit B, an incestuous, sexually predatory, spendthrift emperor who respected no boundaries, moral or financial. It is a powerful and damning indictment. But now, the defense must have its turn. Is there any other way to interpret these stories? Let's start with the incest. While the stories are shocking, their primary source, Suetonius, was a notorious gossip who wrote his histories almost a century after Caligula's death, relying heavily on hostile senatorial sources. No contemporary accounts of this behavior exist. Is it possible that the truth was more nuanced? Caligula and his sisters grew up in a uniquely toxic and dangerous environment. Their family was systematically hunted and destroyed by the paranoid Emperor Tiberius. They clung to each other for survival. Their intense public closeness may have been a natural result of this shared trauma. His public adoration of Drusilla, while extreme, could also be viewed through a political lens. By naming her his heir and deifying her after death, Caligula may have been experimenting with a different model of rule, one borrowed from the Hellenistic kingdoms of the East, particularly a Ptolemaic Egypt. In Egypt, brother-sister marriages among royalty were common, designed to keep the bloodline pure and consolidate power. The deification of royal family members was standard practice. Caligula, who was fascinated by Eastern models of absolute monarchy, may have been attempting to introduce these concepts to Rome as a way to elevate his family above the squabbling Roman aristocracy and establish a true dynasty. To the traditional Roman senators, this foreign, un-Roman behavior would have been twisted into the most scandalous interpretation possible: incest. Now, let's address the palace brothel. This is one of the most difficult accusations to verify. It is entirely possible that this is a complete fabrication, a piece of vile propaganda designed to make Caligula seem as sordid as possible. However, there might be a kernel of truth that has been grotesquely distorted. We know that Caligula was in desperate need of money after his initial lavish spending. He introduced a series of new and deeply unpopular taxes on everything from lawsuits to food items. It is historically plausible that he instituted a heavy tax on prostitution. The senatorial historians, who despised being taxed by an emperor they saw as a degenerate, could have twisted this reality into a more sensational story. He didn't just tax prostitutes, he turned our wives into them. It transforms a grubby financial dispute into a grand moral outrage. Finally, the extravagance. There is no doubt that Caligula was a lavish spender. But was it madness, or was it also policy? In the Roman world, an emperor's legitimacy was partly based on his ability to provide bread and circuses, panem et circenses. Generosity and public spectacle were not just whims, they were essential tools of statecraft, a way of keeping the vast, volatile population of Rome happy and loyal. Caligula's games, banquets, and public giveaways, while wasteful from an aristocratic perspective, were wildly popular with the common people. It secured his power base and insulated him from senatorial plots. What a senator saw as insane waste, a plebeian saw as the generosity of a benevolent ruler. His spending was a political investment. When viewed through this lens, the image of Caligula begins to shift. The incestuous monster becomes a ruler experimenting with a foreign, dynastic model of power. The pimp emperor becomes a desperate fundraiser using unpopular taxes. The spendthrift madman becomes a populist politician securing his base. This does not make him a good man. It doesn't excuse his cruelty or his arrogance, but it challenges the simplicity of the monster narrative. It suggests that many of the stories that have defined him may be deliberate misinterpretations, malicious rumors, and political propaganda of the highest order. The jury is now faced with a difficult task: to separate the actions of the man from the reputation created by his enemies. Was the imperial palace truly a house of horrors, or was it merely the target of the most vicious smear campaign in ancient history? We have now examined the charges of divine madness and personal depravity. The defense has argued that these could be the calculated acts of a political manipulator, or the exaggerated slanders of his enemies. But now we arrive at the final and perhaps most important exhibit. Here, the lines between madness, political calculation, and propaganda begin to blur, revealing a core of cruelty that is difficult to dispute. We move beyond the rumors of the bedroom and the theater of the gods, and into the cold, hard reality of state-sponsored terror. Exhibit C presents Caligula not as a madman or a deviant, but as a meticulous and creative architect of fear. While the stories of his personal excesses are sensational, the most verifiable and historically concrete aspect of Caligula's reign was his systematic use of terror as an instrument of policy. His most effective weapon in this campaign was the revival of the Maestas trials, or treason trials. His predecessor, Tiberius, had used these trials to create a chilling atmosphere of paranoia in Rome, but Caligula initially abolished them, earning him widespread praise. This act of mercy, however, proved to be short-lived. Once his treasury was depleted and his relationship with the Senate had soured, he brought the treason trials back with a vengeance. But Caligula's trials were different. They were not merely a tool for eliminating political rivals. They were a form of psychological theater. The charges were often absurd. Men were accused of treason for selling a property on which a statue of the emperor stood, or for mentioning a goat in the same breath as Caligula, as the emperor was sensitive about his thinning hair and allegedly hairy body. The goal was not justice, but the creation of an environment where any action, any word, could lead to ruin. Once a senator was accused, his fate was sealed. The trials became a gruesome source of revenue. Upon conviction, the victim's property was confiscated by the state, that is, by Caligula himself. He was said to have attended the trials in person, observing the proceedings and the subsequent tortures with a cold, analytical curiosity. This wasn't the work of a distant, paranoid emperor like Tiberius, hiding on his island of Capri. This was the work of a man who wanted his enemies to see his face as their world collapsed. Beyond the formal mechanism of the courts, Caligula perfected the art of personal, psychological torment, particularly directed at the senators he so despised. The historical accounts are filled with stories that illustrate a chilling, almost playful, cruelty. Suetonius recounts how Caligula would force high-ranking senators, some of whom had served as consuls, to run for miles behind his chariot, dressed in their togas, humiliating them in front of their peers and the public. It was a physical manifestation of their subservient status. In another, more horrifying tale, he invited a senator to a lavish dinner on the very same day he had ordered the man's son to be executed. The father was expected not only to attend, but to appear cheerful, to laugh at the emperor's jokes, and to participate in the festivities. Any sign of grief would have been interpreted as defiance, and would have meant his own death sentence. This was a masterclass in psychological torture, forcing a man to become a performer in the theater of his own tragedy. Caligula was demonstrating that his power was so absolute, it extended even to the control of his subjects' emotions. His cruelty could also be capricious and terrifyingly random. At the opening of a new bridge, he was said to have been in a festive mood. But as the ceremony concluded, he suddenly ordered his guards to throw a large section of the crowd into the river below. No reason was given. It was a pure, unadulterated display of the power of life and death, a reminder to everyone present that their existence depended entirely on his whim. Perhaps nothing encapsulates his philosophy of rule more than his most infamous and likely authentic quote. While embracing his wife or mistress, he would allegedly say, "This beautiful throat will be cut whenever I please." And in a moment of rage against the unmanageable crowds at the games, he uttered the line that would define his legacy, "Utinam populus Romanus unam servicem habere." I wish the Roman people had but a single neck. Let us pause to analyze this statement. It is more than just a momentary flash of anger. It is the core of his political ideology distilled into a single, brutal image. The fantasy is not just about mass murder, it's about efficiency and control. It represents a frustration with the messiness of ruling over millions of individuals, each with their own thoughts, loyalties, and potential for defiance. It is a yearning for a world where power can be applied with the simple, clean finality of a single axe stroke. It is the ultimate expression of tyrannical desire, to reduce the complex body of the state to a single, vulnerable point of submission. While the defense could argue that the stories of incest and divine impersonation were exaggerated propaganda, the evidence for Caligula's use of terror is far more robust. It is corroborated by multiple sources, including the more sober historian Tacitus and the philosopher Seneca, who was himself a senator and narrowly escaped Caligula's wrath. The revival of the treason trials is a documented fact. The climate of fear that gripped the Senate is undeniable. This is where the madness defense begins to crumble. The actions described in this exhibit are not random or chaotic. They are methodical. They are targeted. They have a clear political objective: the complete and total subjugation of the Roman aristocracy. This was not the work of a man who had lost his mind. This was the work of a man who had found a terrible new way to rule. He had learned a lesson from the fates of his predecessors. Julius Caesar, who had shown clemency to his senatorial enemies, was assassinated by them. Augustus maintained a fragile peace through compromise. Tiberius ruled through fear from a distance. Caligula chose to perfect the use of fear and apply it personally, face to face, with a theatrical flair that left his victims not just dead or impoverished, but utterly broken. He used cruelty as a language, and every public execution, every humiliating command, every psychological game was a carefully constructed sentence in his ongoing declaration of absolute power. He was not just a tyrant, he was an artist of terror. He didn't just want his enemies dead, he wanted them to live in a state of perpetual, nerve-shredding anxiety. So the jury must now weigh Exhibit C. Here, the evidence suggests we are not dealing with a simple madman, nor are we dealing with a victim of slander. We are confronted with a highly intelligent, deeply wounded, and sociopathic individual who, upon being granted limitless power, systematically dismantled the psychological defenses of an entire class of people. He turned the Roman state into a laboratory for his experiments in fear. The question is no longer simply, was he mad? The question becomes something far darker. Can a mind be perfectly sane, perfectly rational, and yet be dedicated to a philosophy of pure, unadulterated terror? The evidence is now before you. We have seen the emperor who demanded to be worshipped as a god, a spectacle of arrogance that may have been either madness or a calculated political assault. We have sifted through the sordid tales of incest and debauchery. stories that could be either the literal truth or the poisonous propaganda of his enemies. And finally, we have confronted the architect of fear, a ruler whose use of systematic psychological terror is the most chilling and well-documented aspect of his reign. Now, we come to the final act: the assassination, the aftermath, and the verdict. By January of 41 AD, Caligula had ruled for less than 4 years, but he had successfully alienated every pillar of Roman power. The Senate hated him for their humiliation. The aristocracy feared him for their lives and fortunes. Even the Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers meant to be his personal protectors, had grown to despise him. Their commander, Cassius Chaerea, had become a personal target of the emperor's mockery. Caligula, aware that Chaerea had a high-pitched voice, would taunt him mercilessly, using obscene and effeminate passwords like Priapus or Venus whenever the commander came on duty. It was one humiliation too many. The plot was swift and brutal. On the 24th of January, as Caligula was walking through a secluded corridor beneath the palace, heading to his private theater, Chaerea and other guards cornered him. Chaerea struck the first blow. As the emperor fell, the others swarmed, stabbing him relentlessly, over 30 times. They were not just killing a man, they were annihilating a source of terror. The frenzy did not stop with him. The assassins hunted down his wife, Melonia Caesonia, and stabbed her to death. His infant daughter, Julia Drusilla, named for his beloved sister, was snatched from her mother's arms, and her head was smashed against a wall. The purge was absolute. The entire imperial family was to be extinguished. In the immediate aftermath, chaos reigned. But in the Senate there was a glimmer of hope. For a brief moment, the senators believed they could restore the Republic, that the nightmare of one-man rule was finally over. But it was a delusion. While they debated, the Praetorian Guard, the same men who had murdered their emperor, were already creating a new one. They found Caligula's uncle, the stuttering and bookish Claudius, hiding behind a curtain, and declared him emperor. The age of emperors was not over. It had merely found a new face. But the final act of vengeance against Caligula was yet to come. Once Claudius's power was secured, the Senate enacted the most damning judgment a Roman could suffer: damnatio memoriae, the damnation of memory. It was an official, state-sanctioned act of historical erasure. Caligula's name was to be chiseled off all public inscriptions. His statues were to be pulled down and destroyed. His coins were to be melted down. His decrees were to be nullified. The men who hated him did not just want him dead, they wanted him to have never existed. They wanted to control the story, to ensure that future generations would know him only as the monster they described. And in this, they were paradoxically successful. By attempting to erase him, they created a void. And into that void, the historians, Suetonius, Cassius Dio, Seneca, poured their stories. They filled the silence with tales of madness, incest, and cruelty, creating the black legend that has endured for 2 millennia. The damnatio memoriae ensured that the only narrative left was the one written by the victors. So we return to the central question of this trial. Who was Caligula? The final verdict is now in your hands. Was he the mad emperor? A tragic figure whose mind was shattered by illness, turning him into an unpredictable monster. It's a simple, comforting explanation, but it perhaps fails to account for the methodical and targeted nature of his cruelty. Was he the victim of slander? Was he a flawed but rational populist ruler whose attempts to establish a new Eastern-style monarchy were deliberately misinterpreted and vilified by a hostile Senate? This view explains the propaganda, but it struggles to account for the sheer weight of evidence for his genuine, personal cruelty. Or was he the calculated predator? A brilliant, sociopathic political actor who was perfectly sane, and who used the performance of madness as a tool to terrorize his opponents and consolidate absolute power? This is perhaps the most terrifying possibility of all. It suggests that the worst acts of his reign were not the product of a broken mind, but of a mind that was working all too well. A mind that had embraced terror as its guiding philosophy. History is never simple. It is rarely a clear-cut case of good versus evil. Caligula was almost certainly not the cartoon monster his enemies painted him to be. But he was also, without a doubt, a brutal and dangerous tyrant. The true horror of his story may not lie in the individual acts of depravity, but in the way it reveals how easily a system can produce a ruler who operates beyond all moral boundaries. He was a product of a political world where assassination was commonplace, where power was absolute, and where the lines between man and God were beginning to blur. The story of Caligula is a permanent warning. It is a testament to the fact that history is a narrative, and those who write it hold immense power. He serves as a reminder that when we hear tales of monsters, we must always ask, who is telling the story, and why? Thank you for serving on this jury. History is not a collection of dusty facts. It is an ongoing trial, and its most important cases are never truly closed. If you wish to continue excavating the buried truths of the past, join us. Leave your verdict in the comments below, madman, victim, or predator, and do not forget to subscribe, so you are not found in contempt when the next historical trial is called to session.